I'm the General Secretary of the National Council of Hindu Temples. I've drawn the short straw this morning in terms of both being at the cenotaph and rushing over to be here. But aren't we all nice people? Yeah? The subject which I was given to speak on was non-violence. And as those of you who have perhaps studied Indic faiths and Indian history, you've probably come across the word ahimsa, which everybody nods, and we all know that it means non-violence. But it's a remarkable coincidence struck me as I was sitting here, and when Pejman had said this is what we'd like to speak to you on. Earlier this year, we had booked a committee room in the House of Parliament to do a talk on ahimsa, non-violence, and it's been booked about 2 or 3 months in advance. The day came, and I arrived to have this conversation, and we had MPs coming in and out. And it was the day when the lower chamber was actually deciding to embark on airstrikes in Syria, completely the antithesis of a moment of non-violence. So we were having very interesting conversations with them. And today I'm here talking about non-violence, again at somebody else's behest, on Remembrance Sunday, when I've just been engaged in remembering the lives of very valiant souls who sacrificed their own existences for our freedoms. So somewhere somebody or something is saying, Satish, talk to these people about non-violence. So I'm going to try and squeeze non-violence into 5 minutes, which in itself is an act of violence. But we have a prayer from one of our oldest scriptures, the Rig Veda, and it says whenever people of differing traditions and journeys meet, there is an invocation that we use to create a container within which that dialogue can be conducted. So I'll start with that invocation. It's only 2 or 3 lines. But in essence, it's, may divinity guide us and nourish us and protect us. May we learn from each other in a spirit of harmony, trust and affection. May our efforts together be rewarded with illumination, which we carry into our own communities. And may there never be harsh words between us. So whenever 2 people sit to share knowledge, this is the invocation that we use, and I would commend it to the House, and hopefully it will guide and nourish us on this engagement. Non-violence. Being from the tradition, and I love saying this whenever you're here, Pejman, being from the tradition of infidel idol worshippers, as we're known, there are a couple of warnings that I'll toss in. Firstly, being an infidel, it would be an act of violence for me to expect you to believe anything I say. So feel free not to be offended by anything that I say. You don't have to accept it at all. Now, turning to this notion of interfaith and non-violence and respect, we are known as a Hindu community for not really engaging in interfaith. In fact, we're often dragged into it fighting, screaming and kicking, because our belief is that until we have learned to walk alone without harming the other, you have nothing to offer to interfaith. And there's a little tale which I'm going to share with you. Yes, I am. Why not? We've all been very nice so far, so I'm going to toss something a little bit more contentious in. And I know it's been after lunch, so I'm going to try and keep everybody awake. But there was a wonderful, very compassionate lady who was walking home from the fields in rural India once upon a time, and she came across a tiny little snake. And that tiny little snake had been lying in the sun. It was shriveled up. It was literally at death's door. So she picked it up, being compassionate, and held it close, warmed it, and tried to give it some shade, splashed some water on it, and it wrapped itself around her little finger. It was only a tiny little snake. She became very attached to it and took it home. Nourished it, fed it, nurtured it. And over the years, it became very, very affectionate with her, and she used to wear it like an ornament around her arm. 5, 6, 7, 12, 13 years passed, and this snake grew to 20, 30 feet in length. And it would never leave her side. And as the years passed by, she became very close to it, and one day she noticed that it was actually diminishing in size, and the skin had become less lustrous, and it shriveled, it lost its appetite. She became very, very concerned for this snake. And so she took it to the local vet and said, this is the problem. Have you ever seen this? And he said, actually, I haven't. And she went from door to door, pillar to post, trying to find out what was wrong with this snake. And eventually somebody said, well, there's that elderly chap who as there's always an elderly chap sitting on the corner of a village, isn't there? So there's that elderly chap sitting on the corner of this village. Perhaps you could go and ask him. He might have something to offer. And she went to him, and he looked at her, and he said, does this snake sleep with you? Does it lie in the same bed as you? And she said, yes, it does. How on earth did you know that? And he said, does it wrap itself around you? And she said, yes, it does. It's very affectionate. And he said, okay. Now, my talk is about violence and non-violence. We have an understanding that violence occurs on a physical plane, it occurs on a mental plane, an emotional plane, and an intellectual plane. And unless each of us has mastered our own capacity for violence on each of those planes, we represent a threat to the other. So our journey is always first self-mastery so that you do no harm. And the reason I say that is that interfaith is very alluring, and there is a concept of a pious ego, which is an artifice whereby we handcuff ourselves with the necessity to be nice, courteous, polite, delightful, accommodating, I shouldn't have said that, I was thinking. And unless we can challenge that directly, then that itself is an act of violence. Now, I'm very conscious that the most active and dynamic players in the interfaith space are also those who have the most violent recent history. And this is something that we're aware of and are very wary of. And from our perspective, there are still very active, dynamic groups engaged in emotional, intellectual, and physical violence in the interfaith space and on the international arena. It's very tempting to ignore the violent parts within us and enhance and focus upon our commonalities, all those wonderful things that we share in common, whilst conveniently ignoring those things which are a perpetual, perennial source of conflict. And until we address those sources of violence, I think interfaith cannot proceed further. There is always the fear of having... I had a meeting with the Archbishop once, and he said we should be friends. And I said, well, how do vegetarians and cannibals be friends with each other? Right? And so this notion, I'm going to wrap up with the tail end of my story, which was that the elderly gentleman, he said, okay, this is a snake. It has its nature, and what it's doing is it's starving itself so it can eat you. So those who come to interfaith need to be aware of traditional snakes. Okay. And I submit that to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Satish.